Okay, this is the PowerPoint presentation for Chapter 2 for CRJ 113, Criminal Law. The chapter is Constitutional Limitations on Criminal Law. It is necessary for us to review some constitutional issues that go along with criminal law and really go hand in hand with criminal law. So that is what Chapter 2 is about, and that is what this presentation is about. First thing to understand is that we have 51 constitutions. Why 51? That's because we have a federal constitution, the Constitution of the United States, and then the 50 states each have their own constitution. So there's 50 individual state constitutions, and then there's one federal constitution. And the odd thing about it is they are virtually identical. At least the first portions of them are. The latter portions of the state constitutions start to get into individualized state issues and things particular with the state. But the first portions, when they were first written, they were written virtually identical to the US Constitution. So that being said, there still are some differences that we need to work through. The federal constitution provides protections from the government in every state. So whatever protections are in the federal constitution, they apply in every state because it's a federal constitution. The federal constitution provides minimal constitutional protection. State constitutions protect in the individual state. So the state constitutions provide protections only in that state. And they can provide more protection than the federal constitution. So what does that mean? The federal constitution, and when it's interpreted by the United States Supreme Court, provides citizens minimal protection, or what we call the floor, where it starts. That's where your protection starts. So for example, the federal constitution has the Fourth Amendment. All state constitutions have an amendment that is identical to the Fourth Amendment. And the federal constitution under the Fourth Amendment, the US Supreme Court interprets that in a certain way. And when they interpret that, their interpretation provides at the bare minimum protection that we get from Fourth Amendment protections. Now, the state constitution will have an amendment exactly like the Fourth Amendment, but the state Supreme Court can interpret its own state constitution differently than the federal government interprets its constitution. And when the state does interpret its constitution, it can do so to provide more protection than the federal constitution allows. It cannot do the opposite. It cannot take away any protections. It can give more protections. For example, in Rhode Island, DUI checkpoints are illegal. Now, the United States Supreme Court has stated that DUI checkpoints do not violate the federal constitution's Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures. Rhode Island Supreme Court said, well, that's fine, but we interpret our Fourth Amendment to say that that does violate our Fourth Amendment. And police conducting DUI checkpoints is unreasonable under our Fourth Amendment. So in that instance, the state of Rhode Island gave its citizens more protections from the police. It stated that the police cannot stop you at a DUI checkpoint in Rhode Island because it violates Rhode Island's constitution. That's an example how a state can give you more protection than what the federal constitution can provide. Now, the opposite would not be true. Let's say that the Supreme Court has interpreted that DUI checkpoints do violate the Fourth Amendment. The state of Rhode Island would not be able to say that under our Constitution, it does not violate our Fourth Amendment. Because now, in that case, the state would be taking away protections that have been provided by the federal Constitution. So states cannot go below the minimum protection that the federal Constitution gives us. They can always give us more protections from the government. So they cannot provide less protection, but they can provide more protection. And back to the federal Constitution, we have the Bill of Rights. After the Constitution was written, we decided that we still needed more protections. We needed some individual rights that we take so seriously that we want to add it to our Constitution to protect us from the government. And we call that the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Of course, amendment means to add on to something. So after the Constitution was written, we added these 10 amendments and we called them the Bill of Rights. And we call it the Bill of Rights because these 10 amendments protect our individual rights. We'll take a look at those rights in a minute. So that's what the Bill of Rights are. If you've heard that term, the Bill of Rights, these are rights that we have stated, that we wrote down and added to our Constitution. It said these are our rights and the government cannot violate our rights. Our law is really broken down into two types: procedural criminal law and substantive criminal law. Procedural criminal law means it's procedures the government uses to enforce substantive criminal law. And substantive criminal law is the law itself. It's laws that are written. And procedural criminal law are the procedures the government uses when they want to enforce laws. So if the police are going to enforce a certain law, procedural criminal law and procedural due process state there's certain procedures that the police must follow when they enforce laws. If they go outside those procedures, now they're violating our constitutional rights. And some of our procedural criminal law is search and seizures under the Fourth Amendment. We have a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures according to the Fourth Amendment. So how the police search and seize us falls under procedural criminal law. The right to counsel and self-incrimination protection. These are all procedures that we have built into our Constitution that the government must adhere to, especially when they want to enforce substantive criminal law. So if they want to charge you with a crime, they can't force you to make a statement against against yourself. That's a procedure that we have that's built in and protected. And that comes, our procedural due process comes from the 5th and 14th Amendments. And they provide that the government cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process. Now, that doesn't say that the government can never deprive us of life, liberty, or property. So that's why we have the death penalty. That's why you can be put in jail. That's why sometimes the government can seize our property. What the 5th and 14th Amendment says, that if the government is going to do that, they must do it with due process. And due process, in a word, means fair. So if they are going to deprive us of our liberty, the process in which they deprive us of our liberty must be fair. Whatever that process is, it must be fair. Same thing with if they're going to seize our property, or if you get put to death as a sentence to a crime you committed. However they put that person to death, the process in that must be fair. And that's what the 5th and 14th Amendment provides for due process. And it also provides for equal protection. And equal protection means that laws cannot treat people differently. Laws have to treat people equally. You cannot pass laws that treat groups of people differently from other groups of people. And that's a very general statement. And when you take criminal procedure, we get into much more detail, due process and equal protection. And we learn when the government can treat people differently. And there are exceptions to every rule. And that's what we learn about in criminal procedure. But for the purposes of this class, just understand that in general, equal protection means that laws cannot treat people differently. And we also have what's called Bill of Attainder and ex post facto laws. And Bill of Attainder means that you cannot be punished without a trial. And it also means that the punishment cannot change. So if you committed robbery yesterday, and when you committed that crime yesterday, the sentence for robbery was 5 years in jail. And today, they passed a new punishment for robbery and made it 10 years in jail. But you committed the crime yesterday. They cannot go back in time and now charge you and now punish you for 10 years. Because when you committed that crime, the punishment was only 5 years. So they can't change the punishment and make it retroactive. And ex post facto is very similar, sometimes called the principle of legality. And this also means you can't go back in time, but this means it just a little different. This one means that ex post facto means they can't punish someone for a past act that was not a crime at the time they committed that act, but is a crime now. So yesterday you do this certain thing, and today, whatever it was you did yesterday, they made it a crime. Well, when you did it yesterday, it was not a crime, so they can't go back in time and say, it's a crime now, so now we're going to charge you with that. You can't do that. That's ex post facto, and that is in our Constitution. And one of your homework assignments the homework assignment for this chapter was about fair notice and vagueness, and the chapter goes into that. So for example, if there's a law that says one cannot act disorderly in public, is that a valid law? Well, under fair notice and vagueness, it is not, because laws must be clearly defined. people must know what they are forbidden to do. And if you look at a law that says one cannot act disorderly in public, it's not really telling people what they're forbidden to do, because the word disorderly can mean different things to different people. There's a variety of ways a person can be disorderly. And this law, the way it's written right there, is so vague that it's impossible for people to know what is forbidden, what is disorderly. So in order for that law to be valid, to give fair notice and vagueness and not be vague, is it would have to tell you what is disorderly. And later on in the semester, we will look specifically at disorderly conduct laws. But what we will notice is that with disorderly conduct laws, it will say one cannot act disorderly, and then it will follow up with listing ways people can be disorderly. In other words, forbidden behavior that qualifies under disorderly. And that is valid because now it's not vague anymore. It's telling you what you can or what you cannot do. Whereas just a simple statement of one cannot act disorderly in public, it's too vague. That brings us to substantive criminal law. And this class we have is a substantive criminal law class. That's why we kind of breeze through the due process of procedural criminal law. Because you're going to take a class, criminal procedure, that concentrates solely on procedural criminal law. So substantive criminal law is really the law themselves. It defines criminal conduct and the penalty. So it's the laws that we write. It's the laws that we have. You know, there's substance to it. That's why it's substantive criminal law. But it's limited by the Bill of Rights. We just learned about the Bill of Rights and our 10 rights or personal rights that we have under the Bill of Rights. And you can see the Bill of Rights on page 41, figure 2.1. And here it is right here. So if the government is going to pass laws under substantive criminal law, they have to make sure that it doesn't violate our Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment provides protection for freedom of speech, freedom of exercise of religion, freedom of assembly. And again, in criminal procedure, we go into great detail, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth and Sixth Amendment. And if the government is going to pass a law that prevents us from saying something, then it has to pass First Amendment tests. There's tests that we apply in the First Amendment to determine whether the government can pass that law that restricts our freedom of speech. It doesn't say the government can never do that, but when they do, it must do so fairly. So this is where procedural criminal law oversees substantive criminal law, making sure that the process, when they are depriving us of our right, the process is fair and doesn't violate our constitutional rights. And the Fourth Amendment itself, let's take a look at this really quickly. It protects us from search and search and seizures. And what the Fourth Amendment says is that the government cannot search us or seize us or our property unreasonably. If the government is going to search or seize us or our property, it must be reasonable. So we get our protection from unreasonable search and seizures from the Fourth Amendment. In the First Amendment, our freedom of speech. Like every right that we have, it is not an absolute right. The government can regulate certain speech. For example, clear and present danger. If somebody shouts fire in a crowded movie theater, that is not what we call protected speech. Protected speech is speech that's protected under the First Amendment. But free speech is not an absolute right. The government can regulate certain speech. And one type of speech the government can regulate is what we call clear and present danger. In other words, if somebody says something that's going to create a clear and present danger, then the government can forbid or pass a law to prevent somebody or to punish somebody for using such language. Another type of speech that is not protected under the First Amendment is what we call fighting words. It's when people use words that are so offensive that it would bring the average person to violence. Those words are not protected by the First Amendment. So the government can pass laws and punish people for using what we call fighting words. And certainly threats. Threats are not protected speech. You don't have an absolute right to go around threatening people. So the government can punish us if we threaten people. It's not protected speech, and therefore the government can regulate that by punishing or passing laws that prohibit people from using threatening language. And then finally, let's take a quick look at punishment, and let's see how procedural criminal law and punishment mix. So punishment, we look at the Eighth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment says that cruel and unusual punishment is prohibited. That means that if the government is going to punish us, that it cannot be cruel and unusual, that the process they're going to use to punish us must be fair and cannot be cruel and unusual. And there's two ways to be cruel and unusual. The first is it must be proportionate to the offense. So if you litter on the sidewalk and you're sentenced to 5 years in jail, that would be cruel and unusual because it's not proportionate. It's not proportionate to the offense you committed. If you robbed a bank and you got 5 years in jail, that would be proportionate. So that wouldn't be cruel and unusual in that way. So one way to be cruel and unusual is we look at the proportionality of the offense to the punishment. If you got a $50 fine for littering, that would be proportionate to that offense. If you go to jail for littering, that would not be proportionate to the offense, and it would violate the Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment. And the second way the government can violate the Eighth Amendment is the methods they use cannot be cruel and unusual. So I'll give you a couple examples of this. Let's go back to the littering. Let's say you littered, and as your punishment, they shackle you and they put you in public in shackles for a day. So that, and they put a sign on you that says you are a litter bug. Well, that method would be cruel and unusual. And the method they use can also apply to the death penalty. Now, if somebody goes and they murder a family and they do so brutally, and this is not a political statement, and it's not my personal views on the death penalty, just factually speaking, and what our Supreme Court has ruled, if a murder is so heinous enough then the death penalty is appropriate. And so the procedure the government uses in taking your life away, at least the proportionality fits the offense for the death penalty in that case. Again, we're talking about somebody who committed a heinous murder. However, how somebody is put to death cannot be cruel and unusual. The method that's used cannot be cruel and unusual. And there is arguments that is happening right now in this country that lethal injection is cruel and unusual because sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes the person suffers when they get this, it's like a two-part injection that they get. The first injection is supposed to lull them to sleep, and then the second injection is the one that's supposed to kill them. So if they are lulled and they are, passed out and put to sleep, then they don't feel the death, the pain from the second injection. However, there are people where the first injection does not work and they still are awake and conscious for when the second injection is done. And that can be very painful and cruel and unusual. So there's an argument going on now in this country that lethal injection violates the Eighth Amendment because the method is cruel and unusual. And that's why there's only certain ways we can put people to death. That's why we don't have chain gangs anymore. Down in the South, we used to have chain gangs. When people were sentenced to prison time, they would have to go out in shackles and chains, and they were forced to do hard labor. And that was determined to be cruel and unusual because that method of punishment was disproportionate and cruel and unusual. So that's a very quick look at Chapter 2. We don't go into too much detail in Chapter 2 here. We really start getting into the material once we get beyond Chapters 2 and Chapters 3. And these are the important points that I wanted to make for this chapter and points that you will have to be responsible for when it comes to any quizzes. So I am available. Should anybody have any questions, please contact me, and we will see you the next recording.